Thank you, everyone who is with us already. Some people I know will be taking a few minutes to join, so we're just going to wait a couple of minutes before we get properly started. Thanks. Okay, so I think we're probably good to get started now. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I know we've got people from lots of different time zones, so whatever time it is where you are, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk about my new book, Between Extremes, which, if at the end of this you have any interest in buying, there will be a 40% discount code in the chat. Um, it's a little strange doing it this way virtually, even having taught through COVID, still getting used to these virtual settings. But actually, it's really a huge benefit because it's so much more accessible to so many more people than we could get in a room. And so I'm incredibly grateful to LSU for setting this up, for putting it on, and in general for being such a wonderful press to work with throughout the process. Before I get into the details of the book, I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about my kind of journey, my personal journey to get here. It's not the maybe most conventional academic path, but it's one where history and politics have kind of always combined for me. So I suppose first got hooked on American history as an undergraduate at Oxford, where I studied history and politics. But I then went and worked in British politics for 4 years, running a MP's office in Westminster, so kind of doing politics directly. Felt like I had unfinished business in academia, and so it was at that point that I went back, did a PhD at UVA, spent some wonderful time in Charlottesville with the community there. Then came back across the pond, did a short postdoc at Oxford, and then I spent the past 5 years teaching history and politics at a high school in London. A lot of it American, sometimes not exactly in the curriculum, but I get it in there. And I've used the very generous British school holidays to be able to continue working on the book. Part of giving that background, I think, is just to sort of say that being part of politics, studying history and politics together, teaching them together, I think has had a big influence on the book and on how I think about both history and politics. So here is the book. I'll get it forward there so we can see it. Hopefully that's coming through. Wonderful cover that LSU did, Between Extremes, Seeking the Political Center in the Civil War North. I'm going to start off telling you a little bit how the project began before talking about how it evolved and what the kind of key takeaways are from the book as it's in its final form. So I wanted to write about the Civil War era. I'm fascinated by the Civil War era. And the project first began with my interest really in federalism. It's a real contrast to studying UK politics. Being in the UK, we don't have a federal system. And I'm fascinated by the way the US federal system shapes politics, shapes governance, shapes political parties. It's something that I've written articles about. And so the idea was, okay, I want to write about this. I want to write about states. And it wasn't initially to be about politics necessarily, but more about governance. There was a wonderful book that I'd read by Matt Goldman, quite an old book now, about Philadelphia during the Civil War, which is kind of a social, political, cultural history. And I thought, okay, well, I'll take Pennsylvania, but I'll expand it to the state level, and I'll look at the governor and the governor's position at the center of wartime life and how governors used their powers to manage all kinds of aspects of the war, social, cultural, etc. Very quickly, when I started doing that and I started looking at Pennsylvania and at Governor Andrew Curtin, who was the governor of Pennsylvania at that time, I started moving in a more sort of overtly political direction because of what I found. What I encountered when I looked at Pennsylvania politics was that it didn't match up to what I thought I knew about Civil War politics. I'd come in with a sense of Civil War party politics in the North, in the United States, being contested between Lincoln's progressive anti-slavery Republican Party competing against a Democratic Party in the North who were, if not pro-slavery, incredibly racist, obsessed with race, and who quickly came to oppose the war and to threaten the nation. What I was finding was that what I was seeing on the ground in the States really didn't match up to those portrayals at all. So I wanted to pull on this thread. I wanted to see if Pennsylvania was an anomaly or if this was a common picture. And so I framed a project where I looked at 6 key states: Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, California, Ohio, and Kentucky. And I picked those states because I felt like they gave, I didn't want to be accused of cherry picking. So I thought from New England to the border state of Kentucky, right over to California, I'm getting the full breadth of political ideology in the North, but also states that were incredibly important in their size, their money, their contributions to the war once it came. And so I structured the book around the national elections of 1860 and 1864, but also the gubernatorial elections in those states, looking at pairs of elections in each year during the war. And what I found as I got into governors' papers, newspapers, personal papers of key politicians, I spent a lot of time in state capitals, was that there was a real story to be told here, one that seemed critical to understanding the outcome of the Civil War. Some countries, I teach a lot of British history, countries like Britain during World War II suspended elections during wartime. The United States never considered that during the Civil War. To do so would have been unthinkable for many, given that preserving democracy was exactly the reason that many Northerners fought. But maintaining elections was a gamble during a war where thousands of lives were lost, and it put immense strain on civilian populations. Politicians who supported the war effort had to keep voters on side long enough to win militarily. The military victory necessary to save the Union depended on electoral success throughout the war. And so it's the key contention, really, of this book, that winning those critical elections was achieved by adopting a form of political centrism that held the nation together long enough to win the war. In state after state, I found evidence of this centrism. Now, I should say that centrism is not a word that was used, it wasn't a phrase that was recognized in the mid-19th century. I've adopted it. It's common to political parlance today, and I think it captures what was going on here. It involved appealing to the political middle ground. And during the Civil War, it was done most successfully by the coalition of mostly Republican politicians who elected Lincoln in 1860. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what this centrism really meant, what it looked like. One, it meant adapting messaging and strategy to take more conservative positions that were likely to appeal to independent swing voters and to Democrats who felt uncomfortable opposing the government in times of war. I think Republicans, they recognized that to fight the war, they needed a bigger coalition than they had before the war. And so they were reaching across the aisle, if you like. And so this meant that, for instance, anti-slavery rhetoric, the thing we most associate with Republicans, was quietened in favor of patriotism. Governors repeatedly identified themselves with the soldiers and with the war effort, and they framed the war as one to restore the nation, the Union, as they of course called it, and democracy, to restore democracy, not to inaugurate freedom for African Americans. When the Lincoln administration did turn to attacking slavery, they nearly always framed it as a means, not as an end. And these were important distinctions. Attacking slavery was a military necessity to defeating the Confederacy, not a goal in itself. Even when, eventually at the end of the war, some started to articulate the case for emancipation more positively, they then framed it as the end rather than the beginning of any racial upheaval in the nation. Things were not going to go further. And emancipation was not the only issue where they did this. During the war, Union Party politicians, Republican politicians, they really didn't want to talk about anything controversial. And every whether it was the draft, whether it was infringing on civil liberties, free speech, it was all explained away as military necessities. And my argument is that these tactics were critical. These tactics allowed Northern voters to support what were revolutionary changes during the war, things like emancipation. They supported these revolutionary changes for conservative reasons. To kind of give you a sense of what this actually sounds like, I'm just going to read you the first page of the book. Campaigning for governor of Ohio in 1863, John Brough told voters that if it had been up to him, he would not have chosen to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Brough backed President Abraham Lincoln, but asked voters only to sustain the administration until the rebellion is crushed out. If voters wanted to revisit wartime measures in a political campaign after Union victory, he promised, "I will go with you." Stumping for re-election in Pennsylvania the same year, Governor Andrew Gregg Curtin supported emancipation as a military measure while assuring voters that not only would freed slaves stay in the South, but the free African American already in the North also would go to the South after the war, as its climate is adapted to his physical conformation. Acknowledging that he had armed African Americans to defend Pennsylvania, Curtin then told voters that with rebels on his state soil, he would have equipped the cloven-hoofed gentleman himself. Brough and Curtin could not be characterized as celebrating the onward march of freedom and progress. Yet running as Union Party rather than Republican candidates, they both won crucial victories that helped cement emancipation and Black military service as electorally viable policies. I hope, you can see there how something as progressive as emancipation, was surrounded by caveats and actually couched in racist tropes. And yet, the victory of those candidates was critical to making these things, emancipation, black military service, realities. And I don't think, for the most part, I don't think this was cynical by these politicians. It's my argument that most of them who articulated these messages, it was what they really believed. It was not just packaging. They, like voters, genuinely needed conservative reasons to support these revolutionary steps. Now, those two politicians I mentioned there, those governors, Brough and Curtin, they illustrate a second element of this centrism that I think is really important to understand. Namely, that Republicans did not run as Republicans. They ran as union parties and attracted significant numbers of Democratic opponents to join their ranks. Now, this has been recognized to some extent by historians, but in a kind of throwaway manner. Namely, that the main time it is written about is in 1864, when Lincoln runs at the head of a national union party. So the name is changed in the 1864 election. And it's portrayed as a cynical attempt to win over a few wavering voters, a few loyal Democrats. I argue that's far from accurate. The case I put is that the National Union Party was not a fleeting, cynical ploy. It emerged from a genuine process that began in the States as soon as, in some cases even before, the war began. With the outbreak of war, in one state after another, the Republican label was dropped, and the Union Party label was adopted. It was these union parties that became the institutional vehicles for this wartime centrism. The National Union Party of 1864 was the logical consequence of what had been happening in these states for the previous 4 years. So the war begins in 1861, and by 1863, the Republican label had been dropped in 70% of congressional races. And again, I think these were genuinely new organizations. The 1864 convention that renominated Lincoln was opened by a Kentucky slaveholder, Robert Breckinridge. And he thundered dramatically, "As a Union party, I will follow you to the ends of the earth and to the gates of death. But as an abolition party, as a Republican party, as a Whig party, as a Democratic party, I will not follow you 1 foot." These Union Party organizations were not old wine in new bottles. Give you one further example. In California, Lincoln had only got 32% of the vote as a Republican in 1860, 32%. By 1863, the Union Party candidate for governor won 59% of the vote. That's a huge change. In most states, the results were not as dramatic as this, but nonetheless, it's a core argument of my book that we need to take these union parties seriously, and that it is these union parties and the National Union Party that won the critical elections during the Civil War. Next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is this centrism. It's interesting to think about why this worked. We've all just been through an election where we saw one of the candidates, Kamala Harris, campaigning with Liz Cheney, trying to win over Republican voters from the other party, and it doesn't seem to have worked. So why did it work during the Civil War? I argue there are some particular reasons why this tactic was so effective. A, party fluidity. It's easy to read the present back into the past and imagine a situation where most people have strong partisan allegiances and you have a stable and quite national in some ways two-party system. But in the mid-19th century, it was very different. Voters were used to seeing parties come and go, and they were used to changing their affiliations. It was not uncommon for people to have voted for 5 or 6 different named parties during their lifetime. I would go even further, as historians Eric Alexander and Rachel Sheldon have recently argued in the Journal of American History. I think the whole idea of a stable two-party system is just inapplicable to much of the 19th century, and certainly the Civil War era. And so this flux, this instability in partisan structures was a key precondition for the success of centrist politics. Another factor was that the politicians who drove these parties, these union parties, they went all in on the strategy. They changed the name, the personnel, and the messaging. They really became new organizations. It was not just the odd stump speaker from the other party. I was genuinely astonished when I looked at this, at the degree to which Republicans went along with this and participated in this. Republicans were often very unhappy. Certainly the radical ones were very unhappy about it. But lots of them stepped aside to let Democrats, until very recently their fierce foes, take the lead. So pre-war Democrats didn't become just cheerleaders. They were elevated to become governors, lieutenant governors, as well as the star attraction on the stump. And Lincoln, of course, replicated this approach. He placed pre-war Democrats in the cabinet, and he took the step, with rather disastrous consequences, of replacing his Republican vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, with Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson in 1864. And so part of why the centrist politics succeeded was because Republicans really did give up a great deal of power and direction over policy to their opponents for the sake of unity. But the biggest factor by far, I think, in the success was the scale of the crisis provided by the war itself. The threat of the Confederacy was a genuinely existential crisis, and it dwarfed all other considerations. And so it allowed politicians across the North to put their differences on hold in order to unite in the service of a larger goal. It allowed an incredible coalition to come together, from radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens to Southerners like Andrew Johnson. But it also stamped a time limit on this. It was never likely to survive beyond Appomattox. There was no mandate here for a progressive Reconstruction. The war was the tie that bound Union parties together, and once the war ended, these coalitions were almost bound to unravel, and new alignments would need to take shape during Reconstruction. And I make this very clear in the chapter on 1864 that Lincoln's National Union Party, even though they were united behind the war, they were incredibly divided on what the South should look like after the war. And so even in their moments of great success, the problems of the future were very evident. The final aspect of the book that I would like to highlight is, again, to do with an element of common ground that existed during the Civil War in the North, and it's over democracy itself and over support for the war. I've spoken mostly about the Republican Union side of things, but Democrats in the North remained, for much of the war, a viable alternative. There was a small vocal minority who were anti-war and sort of borderline treasonous, but their influence and size has been greatly exaggerated. The Democrats actually had great success in 1862 in the midterms with a pro-war message. And so support for the war was part of the center ground in the North, and so was trust in elections, in the will of the people. Historians have focused a lot on the conflict between parties, and so some of these areas of consensus have been overshadowed. Lincoln and his party accepted it when New York, the most critical state to the war in terms of men and money, elected a Democrat, Horatio Seymour, as governor in 1862. They trusted to let this happen, and while it was bumpy, New York continued to work, and Seymour worked with Lincoln to continue the war effort. And similarly, what I found in letters and in diaries was that the vast majority of Democratic politicians and voters accepted the will of the people when they lost elections. And so to end and to illustrate this point, I'm just going to read one more short section from the end of my chapter on 1864. Democrats shared the fundamental belief in the Union and the democratic system that provided its beating heart. Governor Bramlett of Kentucky, a fierce opponent of Lincoln's, never failed to remind his audiences that only one route lay open for remedying the evils in legislation of the administration, namely the peaceful medium of the ballot box. Democrat Horatio Seymour of New York also echoed this point. Confederates had chosen the bayonet. That was not an option available to Northerners. Indeed, it represented the great difference between the North and the South. Seymour always acknowledged that his Northern opponents acted lawfully and hence could be put down only by the ballot. Democrats and Republicans fought bitterly during the war, but in election after election, they upheld the fabric of self-government through the peaceful transition of power after democratic votes. Maria Lydig Daley perfectly embodied this phenomenon. She despaired at Lincoln's inability to win the war and expressed desperation at the thought that he might serve 4 more years. Daley worked tirelessly for George McClellan, Lincoln's opponent, in 1864. But when Lincoln won, she placed her trust in democracy, writing in her diary, "Vox populi, vox Dei," so it must be for the best. Daley recommitted herself to supporting the war effort. This belief in the democratic process remained core to Northern politics throughout the war and formed part of the centrist common ground so rarely noticed. Even though clear and important differences existed, Northern parties had more in common than previously thought. Despite the inflammatory rhetoric of wartime elections, they still served a unifying purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you. Our first question is from Clayton. Question is, did the post-war Republican Party more closely resemble the Republican Party of 1860 or the National Union Party of 1864? And to what degree did the war change the party's disposition permanently?
So it certainly doesn't change it permanently. It's in the immediate, obviously in the very immediate post-war period, I suppose it more closely resembles the coalition of 1864 that Lincoln had put together. And even most Republicans are initially trying to work with Johnson, and Andrew Johnson has great ideas of being able to keep together the 1864 coalition and even enlarge it further, as I talk about a little bit in the conclusion of the book. But very quickly it falls apart. But interestingly, when it does fall apart because of Johnson's opposition to the Reconstruction measures to help African Americans, the 14th, 15th Amendment, etc., it doesn't fall back into the old the 1860 coalition. So actually, I suppose during the later period of Reconstruction, it maybe looks a little bit more like 1860. But actually, there are elements of people who were sort of on the radical side of the Republican in 1860 who stick with Johnson. Someone like Seward sticks with Johnson for a long time. And then by 1872, of course, you've got the liberal Republican movement and that Republican coalition of 1860 or 1864. It looks nothing like either, really, because you have sort of mainstays of the Republican Party before the war who are breaking away and opposing Grant in 1872. So I think, in some ways, both parties disappear, the 1860 party and the 1864 party, and Reconstruction and the new issues of Reconstruction, again, new alignments form, and there are all kinds of people who keep switching. Just amongst the Democrats in the book, you've got some people like Curtin who end up a Democrat after being liberal Republican. Others go back to the Democratic Party they were with before the war. Others stay firm Republicans and in fact become more radical. The questions are changing so quickly, and the issues during Reconstruction that it kind of throws all of that up in the air.
Thank you. Our next question here is about the expectations that you had going into your research. So can you talk a bit about sort of what you expected to find when you started this project, and then which elements of your research most subverted or reaffirmed your expectations?
So I think, as I talked about, I suppose the biggest thing that drove the whole book was that a lot of what I had read, maybe, I mean, there's obviously there's a lot out there you can read, but there are a fair number of kind of big books on both parties, Copperheads by Jennifer Weber, work by Michael Landis on the Democrats, work on the Republicans, even Foner, but also more recent work than that on the Republicans. James Oakes, Jim Oakes's work particularly had given me this view that there was a lot more distance between the Republicans and Democrats than I found, and particularly some sort of Jim Oakes's work really puts across this idea that there was almost not quite a secret plan, but that Republicans from the outset of the war intended all along to end slavery and ultimately probably try and go further. And I just found that when I got into it, that just didn't match up at all. That there were lots of people who were only joining these Union Party coalitions that Republicans were part of, specifically because they promised they wouldn't make targeting slavery a goal, and some of them would abandon it when that did happen. And similarly, it just seemed to simplify the complexity of the process and the fact that during the war, people didn't know in the first year or so of the war, it was perfectly possible that slavery would have survived. Lincoln was not going after it. Some radicals in Congress were, but overall, I mean, that was the biggest thing that I suppose drove me to go in this direction, was that I just felt that the portrayals of the ideology and the membership of the two main parties, Republican and Democrat, were both, the prevailing kind of opinions were really off from what I was finding. There were lots of other interesting things that sort of turned up along the way, and in the book, some of it got taken out, but there's still quite a lot on to do with federalism and governance. And I was fascinated when I got into it about the ways that governors found to help their citizens, sometimes by opposing the Lincoln administration. The War Department hated governors because they were constantly complaining about the draft, fighting with Lincoln, opposing one thing or another. And I found that interesting, that I hadn't quite perceived the way that governors would be able to support the administration while simultaneously distancing themselves from it, and the way that they got more power during the war. I think, again, there's a kind of sense that the Civil War is a time when the national government gets really strong and really large and really powerful, and that came at the expense of the states. And what I found was that just wasn't the case. Actually, the states grew in capacity just at the same time as the national government was. And also, a lot of what the national government was doing, they weren't doing on themselves, as it were. They were coordinating it, but it was still happening through the states. And so, it was astonishing to me that more hadn't been written about governors, given all the levers they were able to pull during the war and all the extra funding and authority they got. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question here is from Natasha. Question is, based on your research, what seems most important to you when you think about revising the way we teach this portion of history, especially at the high school or middle school level?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I suppose I'll take two things. One is that, to me, although I genuinely hadn't expected to write what I wrote, when I did get into it, it made American history writ large make more sense to me in some ways, because I remember when I first learned about Reconstruction as an undergraduate, I was utterly kind of confused because I knew about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and why did you need the 60s civil rights movement if all these rights were given during Reconstruction, and you had African Americans who were being elected to Congress and all across the South what happened in between. And obviously, we know what happened in between with with Jim Crow and segregation taking hold. But to me, that those events make more sense. That the failures of Reconstruction, the descent into a white supremacy and a segregation that was, obviously far worse in the South, but was commonplace in the North in lots of different ways as well. That makes more sense when you understand that the progress that happened during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it's not to say it isn't progress, huge progress, obviously, emancipation, and the 14th and 15th Amendment. But when you understand that people didn't really endorse it for its own merits, that it was actually a lot of those measures were articulated, defended by politicians as ways to win a war, and to punish rebels who'd broken up the nation and to protect democracy, but not really for their own merit, in terms of making real racial equality a part of the United States. When you understand that, when you realize that kind of the right things happen, but often for the wrong reasons, it seems easier to me to understand what happens after, what happens in the late 19th century, and what happens in the 20th century, and why there is still such a huge battle that is required to make racial equality something that is achievable. So that's I suppose the I think the biggest thing when I'm teaching, especially if I'm teaching at kind of a high school level, that would be, I think, the biggest thing that would revise. I do think it's also interesting, the point I made at the end, to see that there was more common ground actually than is constant, than is sort of appreciated, and that ideas like democracy in some ways maybe meant more to the average voter and civilian at that point than perhaps in some ways today in the post-Cold War era. Or certainly, I think it's fascinating that there were these kind of commonalities across the North in terms of what they were fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you talk a bit about what you're working on now in terms of future projects?
Sure. So it's challenging when you're obviously teaching full time and being in the UK. But I do have some ideas now that this is done. The first two sort of come out of this book. So as I talked about, I started off trying to go in a direction of governance, and then for the clarity and of the book and its key intervention, it really focused on political messaging and strategy and the importance of that. But I've got a lot left over from the research and lots of microfilm and lots of notes about the way that governors managed the home front. Even things like, it's fascinating the way in Kentucky they had the power of pardon, and that was used as a way to kind of try and prevent civil strife from breaking out. All these pleas for pardon that are coming in, and you've got the governor writing, well, I don't really know the details of what's happened here, but I know that is an area that's been hit incredibly hard by the war. So let's issue these pardons to try and prevent the lid from blowing off. So I have an idea for an article where I would kind of look at governors' capabilities and powers before the war, look at how they changed during the war, and see what survives beyond the war into Reconstruction, to see whether that growth in the governing capabilities lasts, or whether it just retreats after the war. A second one is Andrew Johnson. So I mentioned Andrew Johnson, and I think this might be the one I kind of first try and do. I've already been kind of playing around with it, started working on it. He's not a nice figure. He's a villain in American history for good reason. I was watched the show Manhunt a little while ago, and he's portrayed as a typical villain there. And it's not that that is wrong, but he's not understood well enough. It doesn't give you a sense of why he was so popular, why he got put on the ticket in 1864. And so I've got a lot that I would like to say about Andrew Johnson. He gives a speaking tour in 1863 and into 1864 across the North. And he's just getting huge crowds. You know, he's obviously, I mean, his racism is evidently clear at that point, but his status as this loyal Southerner who stayed true to the Union, um, and elements of his kind of crassness in some ways, their appeal and how strong their appeal was, and how everyone wanted him to speak. I think it helps us understand a lot about the Civil War era. So I'd really like to do an article focusing on Johnson, and expand out from that. If I ever got to another book project, I want to place Reconstruction in an international lens and look at how imperial ideas, because it's a fascinating period, the late 19th century, when empires are expanding, taking hold. They're fueled by a kind of civilizational hierarchy and social Darwinism. And it's fascinating that at the same time as that is going on, you've got radical Republicans trying to give African Americans the vote and equal rights and political standing. And so I'd like to look at those ideas about race and the developments of Reconstruction in an international context.
Thank you so much. Well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you so much. And just final reminder that if you are interested in the book, there's a link in the chat in the comment section where you can get a 40% discount. Thank you very much, everyone.